Okay, thank you for having me here today. I appreciate the chance to talk to you. My name is James Crabtree. I'm a distinguished visiting fellow at the European Council on Foreign Relations in Berlin and a visiting fellow at the Asia Society in New York. Until not too long ago, I used to run the Asia office of the International Institute for Strategic Studies and helped to organize the Shangri-La Dialogue, where we would welcome the defense minister of the Republic of Korea each year and listen to their statement about Northeast Asian security and how that linked to the wider security of the Indo-Pacific. And I've been asked here to talk today a little bit about North Korea-Russia cooperation, a very timely topic. So what I want to do is look at the context of increased cooperation between the DPRK and Russia in the bigger picture of relations between Europe, the US, and China. Try and say a little bit about what I think the two sides are getting out of this cooperation, and then look at where it might go next and how the cooperation will be viewed in both the United States, but also in Europe. What we're talking about here really, I think, is a pattern of growing cooperation over recent years, but one that has been brought to public mind, in particular by the visit of Vladimir Putin to Pyongyang, as well as to Vietnam in June of this year. The two sides signed a comprehensive strategic partnership treaty, which, as the audience of a lecture like this will be well aware, echoes the mutual assistance treaty that the Soviet Union and North Korea used to have in the 1960s. In particular, the context for this has been shaped by the Ukraine war, where North Korea has been providing weapons privately to Ukraine, but also concerns about exactly what the treaty that was signed by the two sides might mean in the future. You can see a quote on the screen there, if indeed you can see the slides, from President Putin, who talked about mutual assistance in the event of aggression, something that comes very close to the kind of language you would find in an alliance. It also talks about military technical cooperation with the DPRK, which we'll come back to in a second. So this has been the prompt for concern about this, and I think it will have been noticed in the European and North American capitals. In the United States, there's a great deal of concern about a growing axis of cooperation between a quartet of nations that oppose the current global order that the US has shaped, namely Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea. In Europe, these developments are seen predominantly through the lens of the war in Ukraine, which has shaped Europe's attitude to China in particular over recent years, shifting Europe from viewing China as a cooperative international power to a rival and competitor. But it will also shape the way in which Europe looks at the security of Northeast Asia in general and the role of both the DPRK, but also the Republic of Korea. I think it's important to put this within the context of the broader geopolitics of the region. It is worth noting that relations between the US and China have improved somewhat over the last year from a very low ebb around the time that Nancy Pelosi visited Taiwan in 2022 and the balloon incidents which followed. There's been a kind of tentative, very faltering mini rapprochement forged by high-level meetings between the two presidents of the respective countries, but also high-level officials. Within that, however, Chinese non-military aid to Russia has been a consistent sticking point. It's been one of the things that Washington gets most anxious about, and therefore the fact that there is more non-military but also military aid flowing between the DPRK and Russia will also be a cause of genuine concern. From the European side, as I said, Europeans have seen their entire strategic orientation shifted because of Ukraine and will view developments with the DPRK within that I think one way of thinking about this is that Europe is grappling with the fact that nations in Asia are increasingly affecting the European security order. Now, China is the most obvious with its meaningful support for Russia, but the DPRK is another, because the war in Ukraine is so central to the future of Europe. And any country that appears to be putting a finger on the scales is increasingly of concern. And so that will be true for the DPRK. Raja Mohan, who is a well-known Indian commentator, wrote a couple of columns about this recently in the Indian Express and in Foreign Policy, which I thought were apposite, where he talked about the fact that Asian nations are now able to make choices that shape the balance of power in Europe. In the first Cold War, it was the case that it was generally European nations who were shaping the balance of power in Asia. And now there's, at least in a small way, a sense in which it's beginning to flow the other way around. Let me talk. The second thing that I wanted to do is to talk about the motivations of the various sides for the meeting. I think from Russia's point of view, there are many different motivations that were that pushed this deal to happen. I mean, at one level, there are costs to Putin in going to North Korea, because it does underline within the international community and within the global South that Putin has this pariah status, that he's one of the very few leaders willing to meet with Kim Jong-un. That doesn't matter so much with his relationship with the West, but Russia would be concerned about how that would look in terms of its relations with other emerging market nations in the global South. But overweighing that, there are clearly much more important practical benefits, the most important being munitions, where intelligence estimates suggest that the amount of equipment that Russia is getting from North Korea is material in the course of the war. Ballistic missiles, 2.5 million rounds of ammunition, according to estimates. But the trip was also very helpful in a range of different kind of signal sending. It sent a signal to the United States that Russia, if it was pushed, could find ways to share nuclear technology, which is something that the US is very concerned about, the nuclear proliferation risks. It is, I think, a calculated rebuke to recent developments in the US ROK Japan security relationship, which as a trilateral has been growing closer, and that's something that Russia is uncomfortable with, particularly given its historic relations with Japan. And it also sends a signal to South Korea, as this audience will be very familiar with, which has been weighing whether or not it ought to play a more active role in supporting Ukraine, particularly with weapons. And that's something that Russia would like to warn against. North Korea's motivations, I think, are slightly simpler. I mean, any international visit is good, reduces isolation, bolsters domestic legitimacy, but there are also tangible benefits in terms of potential technologies, although we're not clear the extent to which Russia will actually share technologies that it, sort of higher end technologies. It also is useful in terms of the DPRK's relationship with China. It reduces to some degree some practical dependency, but also creates an incentive for Beijing to re-engage with the DPRK, given China would not want another power to have a closer relationship with Pyongyang than it does. And I suppose this is just a general point, that it seems to me that the Ukraine war has been quite useful to North Korea. That opens up some strategic space, gives it an important secondary relationship with Russia to balance its relationship with China. So where does that leave the response in Europe and the United States? It's the last sort of set of things that I would like to address. I think Europe's relationship with the Republic of Korea has been historically more muted than its relationship with certain other Asian powers, particularly the other prominent democracies, Japan, Australia, increasingly India, which is the beneficiary of a lot of attention in Brussels and major European capitals. I think the visit will raise awareness of various DPRK-related risks, both in terms of the cooperation with other authoritarian powers, but also potentially the value of the EU-ROC partnership. The last major visit between Brussels and Seoul happened in 2023 when you had the 10th strategic summit between the two sides, when Ursula von der Leyen and Charles Michel went to Seoul. I think one of the unfortunate, or maybe more positive consequences of this visit is that European leaders will now have a sharper reason to pay attention to Northeast Asia because of concerns about how this will affect Ukraine. I think there have been other reasons why the Korean Peninsula has become more prominent of late, and the most obvious being the role of the South Korean arms industry in supporting European rearmament. Most obviously, its partnership with Poland, but also some other countries. We've seen a number of major deals, and I think that's something that most European defense decision makers simply wouldn't have been aware of before. I think European leaders will continue to ask Seoul to support Ukraine. We saw during the NATO summit that Prime Minister Yoon promised to increase non-military support. So far, South Korea has not shown any sign that it will provide weapons and has reinforced in the recent weeks the nature of its strategic relationship with Russia. But ultimately, European leaders would like to see South Korea as a balance within that conflict, given North Korea's role on the other side. I think in the United States, the concern with Ukraine is substantial, but it's also balanced with much higher profile worries about non-proliferation. Avril Haines, the director of national intelligence, testified before Congress a few months ago, talking about the fact that Russia's actions in North Korea, but also with respect to Iran and others, had the potential to undermine long-held non-proliferation norms, which is quite a significant step. So there have been warnings from the US intelligence community about what Russia may be planning to do, and that, I think, is of major concern to US decision makers. So we, at a basic level, we know what Russia is getting from the DPRK in terms of weapons. What we don't know is what Russia is going to be willing to give in return. Historically, as I have understood this, Russia was not willing to share its most advanced technology with North Korea, but the question, I suppose, is will this time be different? Other consequences, I think this, in a useful sense, Washington may view this as a potential spur to still greater cooperation between the US, the Republic of Korea, and Japan, a relationship that has been moving ahead quite nicely from Washington's point of view. But I suppose we should say that there is, some considerable uncertainty about the direction of US Korean Peninsula policy given the election. It's not clear how a returned President Trump, who that would seem to be the most likely outcome of the election, despite President Biden's withdrawal. He had an eccentric North Korean policy or Korean Peninsula policy in many respects in his first term, and it's not clear how that would develop in his second term. So to conclude, I suppose I would say that Western powers will be watching very carefully to see if this cooperation that was embodied in Putin's visit and has been developing over recent years is going to deepen, and also to see how Seoul chooses to respond to that internationally, particularly with respect to Ukraine. In the United States, the sort of major big picture concern is that the US is facing much closer cooperation between these four rival powers. You can see the quote there by Admiral Aquilino, the outgoing head of Indo-PACOM, who talked in a recent hearing in front of the US Congress about a return to the era of an axis of evil. This is the kind of language that you do hear in Washington increasingly these days. I think more sophisticated analysis or more sophisticated analysts would understand that there are lots of divisions between this grouping. I've already discussed a couple of them with respect to China, the DPRK, and Russia, which is a very uneasy partnership. Nonetheless, that is the predominant way in which the United States is going to interpret this. I think that would be certainly true under a Trump administration, a second Trump administration, or maybe slightly less so in an administration led by a Democrat president. China would view these relationships primarily through the lens of how it affects its relationship with the US. So in a sense, they're mirror images of each other. I think there will be a focus on whether there will be more military cooperation, both bilaterally between Russia and the DPRK, as in trying to understand through intelligence work what Russia is willing to spend in terms of technologies in exchange for the weapons that it is procuring, but also whether this might lead to more trilateral military cooperation with China. This is something that Russia has proposed, but China has not yet agreed to. Generally, China has been a little bit wary of seeking to paint itself as being part of a trilateral arrangement with Russia and the DPRK, at least in public, in part because it still seeks to have a trilateral relationship with Japan and the Republic of Korea. And there was the trilateral China ROK Japan summit not too long ago. And I think ultimately Seoul's response will be watched very carefully. I mean, Seoul is striking a balance between its desire to attract international attention to the situation in the peninsula, but also to avoid being forced into a situation in which it has a rapid deterioration of its relationship with Russia. As I mentioned earlier, over the last week, you've seen a public reaffirmation of the fact that the relationship between Seoul and Moscow remains one that is strategically important. And so far, at least, Seoul hasn't signaled that it is going to be willing to support Ukraine with weapons as its European partners would like. So that's all I had to say. Thank you very much for the invitation. I mean, I think this is an important strategic development, and one that, particularly because of Putin's visit, will be watched more carefully in the months and years to come. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you for your excellent and a very comprehensive, overview and an analysis on the, North Korea, Russia, North Korea approachment, last, a few months or, a couple of years already. I think it's India is another, interesting, actor in this game, and you are covering global issues. But I think it's you published a book on, India, too, and then you are India expert, I can say. And India has been, again, ambivalent on this Russia-Ukraine war. And India has been, very neutral and take advantage of whatever is, on the table for its own national security, national interest, last couple of years. But I think it's India. As far as I understand, India doesn't have the specific official, position on, in the North Korea and Russia rapprochement. But as you know, Russia-India relationship is pretty special. But at the same time, you are aware of India also, the thinking about its own reputation. And then, Russia-India has very close military relationship. And at the same time, it has a very, concern about North Korea's nuclear proliferation. So it's a very mixed picture, and then variables is mixed. And then what's your take on this India's, say, presumed perspective on this in North Korea, Russia, approach?
Indian Prime Minister Modi just went to visit Vladimir Putin in Moscow in a move that was not well received in Europe, because it looked as if, as you say, India was, reinforcing the centrality of its relationship with Russia. And this was the first visit that Prime Minister Modi had taken after his third election victory earlier this year. However, I don't think it's quite right to say that India is neutral in all of this, and I think India has been actively trying to forge stronger relations with not just with the United States and Europe, but also with countries like the Republic of Korea, Japan, and Australia, with the kind of democratic industrial nations of Asia that are worried about China's rise. And so and India is very concerned about closer cooperation between China and Russia. So really, India's strategic imperative on the one hand is that it doesn't want Russia to become too dependent on China, which is India's major long-term rival. Right. And it's also seeking closer relations in general terms with the West. I mean, not to the point that it will ever be a US ally in the way that the Republic of Korea is, but the direction of travel has been reasonably clear. So I think I'm not sure if India would have a strong view on, certainly not as strong as the United States or Europe, on Russia DPRK cooperation. I suppose to the extent that it complicates cooperation between Russia and China, then that may be viewed as a good thing. But as I say, mostly India's concern is about trying to strike a balance between deeper cooperation with the West on the one hand, and not having China and Russia become too close to one another if it can be avoided.
I think it's a pretty interesting and then very informative time for the informed public, not only in South Korea, but also international community who are interested in the North Korea and then reunification issue. Thank you, James.
Very good. Well, thank you for having me. That's great. It was lovely to see you again. I hope to be in Seoul before too long. So.